Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and thanks for the invite from you and Rachel and your colleagues to present in this important series. Like you, also like to start by paying my respects to the local Indigenous mob down here, where Carol and I have decamped down to Turos Head on the south coast, and it's the Yuin Nation down here. So I'd like to pay my respects, and always was, always will be Aboriginal land. What I'm doing today is to uh, reflect on some recent research projects that I've been doing recently to think about racism and vice versa. And basically, as you can see at the bottom of that slide, I've been doing a fair bit of research over the last decade on what I call minority entrepreneurs, Indigenous entrepreneurs, refugees who are entrepreneurs, called immigrant entrepreneurs, Muslim entrepreneurs, and most recently with Simon Darcy, my colleague at UTS, people with a disability who become entrepreneurs who set up a business. And basically, we want to look at the dynamics, the complexities, and the contradictions of racism that research tells us about. How does racism play a role in this entrepreneurship, and what does that mean about how we think about racism? And of course, all these groups are internally complex, differentiated, but they do have as a common denominator individual prejudice and structurally embedded discriminatory practices that block their access to the economy, and they don't get jobs commensurate with their human capital. The interesting thing, if I might say, is that small business and entrepreneurship is not a very sexy topic in the social sciences, perhaps certainly not in the critical social sciences, and people tend to fall into two camps. One is those people who wave the flag of entrepreneurship, the market, the neoliberal camp, who think that it's just terrific, it'll solve every problem. And then on the other hand, you have on the left people who see the petty bourgeoisie as very exploitative of labour. Look at all the stuff coming out of the Fair Work Commission, all the wage theft stuff we see. And so, it's an unusual thing. And the way I got into looking at it, as Kevin said, I've been working in the area of immigrants in Australian society, particularly initially at the working class and immigrants. And it came to my view then, looking at it from a pretty strict Marxist perspective, that, we didn't like the petty bourgeoisie and they were ripping off and exploiting everyone. But then as you look at that study, a lot of immigrant groups turned to setting up a business because they were blocked doing other sorts of jobs. And so that then sort of changed my mind a little bit. And one of the stories I'm telling, in a sense, is that how sort of structural discriminatory practices block the economic access of these minority groups, and a number, not all, of course, not the majority, turn to setting up a small business. And I think if you think in that light, gives you a bit of a different perspective, not to say that the other perspectives don't coexist. The points of theoretical departure, there's a big theory of immigrant entrepreneurship, and I mentioned some of the key trends there. But I'd argue that they all understate really the role of racialisation. And of course, this concept of racialisation introduced by Bob Miles in the early 80s basically says, look, there are no such things as races, they're socially constructed. And by looking at the process of racialisation, we look at how they're constructed and why in different places in different times. Once again, complex, uneven, contradictory. I'd also, of course, draw on Karl Marx and his notion that, people make history, albeit constrained by class relations. And this segues into the sociological concept of agency. We may be pretty much entrapped in circumstances beyond our control, but people will make their lives within those constraints. Karl Polanyi has a very useful take on the way in which he views economies as socially and culturally embedded. And I think that's critical from our research that shows that. And also the concept of social transformation, which is Polanyi's, and Stephen Castles and his colleagues wrote a very good book in 2015 using that particular concept in a number of countries. And finally, we've found that the social ecology model has some very useful insights. particularly into refugee and disability entrepreneurship. Basically, sort of the blocked economic mobility comes from the way in which the formal and informal, individual and institutional practice of discrimination means that a lot of people from these minority backgrounds don't get a job, or if they do get a job, they don't get a good job. It's not meritocratic, it's not commensurate with their human capital. Some on the left see these people falling into a neoliberal trap by seeing the capitalist market as the solution, whereas it's really the cause of their problems. And others fall into, I think, another trap by saying, look at all the barriers these groups face, massive barriers. How can they ever become entrepreneurs? And it's true, we will talk about those. They are substantial. But if you just look at the problems and the barriers and you don't focus on the agency of people and their determination to overcome these barriers, if you don't look at what they have and focus on rather on what they don't have, that leads you to a deficit model, which is, in my way of thinking, a bit of a dead-end street. Some of these photos here of some of the Hazara refugee entrepreneurs in Adelaide that Branka and I have done some research in the past. So let me just talk then to a number of different groups of minority entrepreneurship and to the research I've done fairly quickly because, I want to leave a fair bit of time for discussion and just sort of hit on a few themes and then think about the key topic about, what does that mean for racism and racialization? So first of all, if you look at refugees, they face massive barriers to entrepreneurship. They arrive with no money, no financial capital. If they do have human capital, and the Hazara didn't because the Taliban wouldn't let them become educated in Afghanistan, but even if they do, they're not rewarded for it in Australia. They lack social capital because their family is fractured all around the world, back at home, in the camps, in other countries as refugees. They don't know the Australian regulations and red tape. For a lot of them, their English language, their linguistic capital is very weak. So, how can these people possibly become entrepreneurs? They're not going to make it. But then if you look at the reality is there's a long history of immigrants and refugees as entrepreneurs. And indeed, I'll show you a slide in a second that tells us that, in fact, refugees are more likely than any other group of immigrant arrivals to establish a business. And I say here, this is an apparent paradox because, you say, look, here are the great barriers. They shouldn't be, but they're more likely. How do we explain that? And the answer is their agency, their capacity for risk-taking, their determination to work hard. And for many of them, a prior experience of entrepreneurship. Even in refugee camps, the way in which those places survive is on informal entrepreneurship. If you just look at that data there, the graph on your left, that tells us the number of different immigrant groups that own their own business. And as you can see, those who come with a refugee visa, the purple one on top, is much, much higher than those who arrive on a family or a skilled visa. And the graph on the right just tells us the different national groups amongst refugee entrepreneurs in Australia. I did, as I mentioned, Branka and I did some work on Hazara refugees, entrepreneurs in Adelaide. This is a part of an ARC Discovery grant on refugee entrepreneurship. It's interesting that when we initially put it in, we put it in under the title of Refugee Entrepreneurship in Australia. It was rejected. Some people, one of the assessors said, look, these people assume that refugee entrepreneurship is a good thing. And blah, blah. The next year, we put it in under the title of Humanitarian Immigrant Entrepreneurs in Australia, and we got accepted. Clearly, the refugee word gave it a bad smell in the eyes of some people. But the title of the report we did for that was From Boats to Businesses. And of course, most of the Hazara were in fact boat people. And you all know the political hysteria about boat people and the political opportunism from John Howard to Tony Abbott, to Scott Morrison, etc. about that. So we looked at these people 1 in 3 had a prior entrepreneurship experience prior to coming to Australia. And this is interesting. So they're people who are continuing their experience, their tradition, their interests. For the rest, this is a new strategy, a strategy to cope with the circumstances they confront. One of the very interesting contradictions, that I think most people would be critical of mandatory detention of boat arrivals. The interesting thing is that most of the people were in partnership with other Zara refugees in Adelaide. That's to overcome the lack of capital, etc. And they met their business partners in detention. So the detention camps sort of created a whole new social network of people that then become the family and friends that survive in Adelaide as a community and as a business community. And I think that was a very interesting thing. The other thing is that the way in which these businesses are embedded within the family, as I mentioned, the work of Polanyi correctly recognises, unlike neoclassical economists and economic rationalists, that small businesses are embedded in the social, in the family, in the neighbourhood, in the community. And that means that there are also personal and family costs of entrepreneurship. The contradictions are, I think, important. The other thing about refugee entrepreneurship is that SSI, Settlement Service International, has been engaged in a very interesting project to assist newly arrived refugees set up a business, the Ignite program. And now well over 150, I think it's getting towards 200 refugees, have established a business through that program. And it just goes to show you that this is a very useful policy initiative to assist in refugee settlement in Australia. And this is just a couple of photos of some of those successful refugees who entered the Ignite program and have set up a business. That program is now running in Canada, by the way, by the Immigration Department in Vancouver, that I'm also evaluating. The second group I want to look at is Indigenous people in Australia, Indigenous entrepreneurs, and I don't need to background you on the whole processes, the history of racialisation of Indigenous people and the closing of the gap and all those things. You're very well versed in that. With colleagues, once again, Branko and other colleagues at Charles Sturt University, we did what is the largest, most contemporary survey of Indigenous entrepreneurs across Australia. Some 324 Indigenous entrepreneurs we surveyed, and you can notice there's across private businesses mainly, but also community and cooperative businesses in urban, regional and remote areas. And the interesting thing about this, and I should have talked with the refugee stuff, is the whole gender lens that a number of minority women become entrepreneurs or are very active players in the business of their partners. And you can see there on that graph from Boyd Hunter from ANU, the really low rate of Indigenous entrepreneurship, the blue line at the bottom, far below. It's increased a bit, and there is significant growth in recent years, but it's still very, very, very low. I just wanted to talk about some aspects of this research that relate to the seminar today. We're interested in how Indigenous culture sort of shapes these business experiences, and our conclusion was that it both enables and constrains Indigenous business success. So basically, for a number of businesses, those in maybe the art or Indigenous tourism or services to Indigenous people or corporations or whatever, this is a comparative economic advantage, as my neoclassical economist colleagues would say that they have, and they have an Indigenous market niche there and they take advantage of that. But at the same time, we found how Indigenous culture constrained the business. Here we talked I remember once talking to a woman who ran an Indigenous tourism business out of Darwin, travelling down to Litchfield Falls for a day trip. And, the key thing people wanted there was an Indigenous interpretation of that whole experience. One of her biggest problems, she said, was finding reliable Indigenous people to work with her on that business. And also a number of people across our research talked about the the issue of ceremonial obligations. They really take time that break into the, shall we say, the business time, but also family obligations and so forth with respect to income, and sharing income can be a constraint. But the thing about this, why is it important? Well, basically, if you're going to reduce the gap, you need to reduce the employment gap. And the critical thing is that Indigenous enterprises are far more likely to create jobs for Indigenous people than non-Indigenous enterprises. You see the work by Hunter, once again, Indigenous firms created 300% more Indigenous employment in Queensland than other firms. Our research showed that, most of the, between 50% or more of the firms employed a large proportion of Indigenous workers in their employment workforce, and in particular that female-owned Indigenous businesses tend to employ female Indigenous workers. So once again, if there's a strategy is how to create jobs for Indigenous women, part of that strategy, not all, but an important and shall we say an untapped part in terms of potential is Indigenous entrepreneurship. And I mentioned at the start that one of the key themes is the social embeddedness and cultural embeddedness of small businesses and entrepreneurship. And because the neoclassical model says the business person, economic man, very sexist, of course, just wants to maximize his material satisfaction. The reality across these minority entrepreneurs is that people go into business motivated, sure, to make some money, a living standard for themselves and their family, but also to contribute to the community, particularly their co-ethnic or co-Indigenous community. And you can see there, this is a measure of the community contributions that Indigenous businesses face. And a couple of important ones down here: seek to employ Indigenous people, 100% of cooperative businesses, 94% of community-owned, and 62% of private sector-owned business seek to employ Indigenous people. Volunteer time in the community activity, support local cultural events, etc. So you can see here sort of evidence-based research to show you the contributions that Indigenous enterprises and Indigenous entrepreneurs make in Australia. Just to take another tack on the minority entrepreneurship theme, my PhD student, Ahmed Al-Aslani, who's graduated a couple of years ago, wrote a PhD on Muslim entrepreneurship in Sydney. So here's the interesting question: what role does religion play in immigrant entrepreneurship? Very few people have looked at that across the world. Once again, I don't need to background this audience about Islamophobia and the racism that people of a Muslim background experience. It's certainly there. Mohammed surveyed 300 Muslim entrepreneurs in Sydney and also did some qualitative field work with 20, using the block mobility theory as his point of departure, and also the Klosterman and Rath mixed embeddedness theory. You can see here that the entrepreneurs he surveyed reflect the very diversity of the Australian Muslim population, from Lebanon, Iraq, Pakistan, Australia, because they, of course, were second generation Muslims. And then, sort of Afghanistan, India, Egypt, Kenya, Morocco, etc., etc. And then another 22 different countries from that. So that very thing just shows us diversity and challenges the whole stereotypes on which Islamophobia is based. He used a networking or a snowballing methodology through the mosques in Western Sydney. And part of the thing is looking at, well, how does this block mobility shape your experience? More than half of them had experienced unemployment. And of those, nearly 3/4 had applied for 5 or more jobs. So one of the, you can see there that part of the thing that he was looking at is to try and quantify, well, how much a role does racial discrimination because of your religion play in your experience prior to getting into a business? And then how much does that sort of shape your motivations into getting into a business? This is a little cut out here, but have you faced discrimination at the workplace because of your religion? Have you left a job because of discrimination? Overall, sort of basically, 92 out of the 300 had faced discrimination and had left their job. Another 44 had faced discrimination but not left their job. But basically, less than half reported they'd experienced discrimination. So what we conclude from that is that the discrimination is more structural, but also the fact is that people move into entrepreneurship not solely because of the experience of racism. Sometimes their religion shapes the businesses they have, halal food, for example, in restaurants, and things such as that. But in a lot of cases, it has nothing to do with the sorts of businesses that these particular groups set up in Sydney. Most of them, of course, lived in and set up businesses in Western and Southwestern Sydney. The next group I wanted to talk about was the group of people with disability. Now, to some extent, this is a bit of an outlier because the seminar is about, racialisation. And people with disability suffer discrimination, not because of their racial origin, although those who are Indigenous or, refugees or whatever would have that, shall we say, double jeopardy. But their key source of discrimination and prejudice is because their ability. We know there are very high rates of unemployment, much lower levels of employment, the data is given there, but at the same time, higher levels of self-employment than the non-disabled population, according to ABS data. Now, my colleague at UTS, Simon Darcy, were talking about the previous research I'd done and discussed this, and we thought, all right, well, let's just have a look at what the research tells us. Well, what are these, what do we call them, disability entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs with disability? What's their experience? Where are they? What's their story? When we went to have a look at the literature, there was basically none. We then applied for a linkage grant with a number of industry partners, including Settlement Services International, to do some work in this field. And we're just now finishing the second and final report of that linkage grant. And basically our methodology, like I've done in most of these projects, is some quantitative and qualitative. We did a snowball survey of over 100 entrepreneurs with disability, using, once again, our industry partners and our disability organisations and their networks to promote the survey. In addition, we got another 60 respondents with disabilities from a thing called the Startup Master Survey, which is an annual survey about new business startups right across Australia. And on top of that, we did some qualitative interviews, 52 with entrepreneurs with a disability and 20 with key stakeholders. The theoretical framework that we were sort of using there was the social ecology model, basically. In other words, there are a number of different lenses of that. I mean, one lens of the social ecology model is you move from the global to the national to the provincial or state to the city or town to the neighbourhood, those sort of spatial levels of disaggregation. And also there's a multi-institutional sort of approach and also the social embeddedness of people, because clearly, the background of people with disability, the same as the background of refugees and others, shapes their experience to date, their experience in the labour market, their opportunities, and hence their motivations to turn towards setting up a business. And many of our informants talked about block mobility and the discrimination they faced in getting a job. And when they did get a job, they experienced what the late Graham Hugo called occupational skidding. In other words, a job way below their capacities. Um, and but this experience of discrimination, this time sort of not racial discrimination, but nevertheless discrimination, prepared them for their challenges. And similar to the indigenous and the refugee entrepreneurs and the Muslim entrepreneurs, great persistence, great determination, uh, a great appetite for risk, because if they don't take the risk, nothing's going to happen for them. And, you know, in all these cases, the common denominator is often entrepreneurship is a way of people creating their own jobs, jobs that won't be provided otherwise. And it's a fairly highly contradictory phenomena. And we've got some detailed reports. All these research projects have reports that are available in the bibliography that you can follow up. So let me then start trying to sort of think about where we come to from all that. Well, because I was sort of worked as an economist and in an economics faculty and the business faculty uh, all my life, all my academic life, it's interesting to sort of think about neoclassical economics. And, you know, I was involved with the political economy movement at Sydney University in the 70s, precisely because of the inadequacy of economic rationalism and neoclassical economics. And basically, they just don't get racial discrimination. The key theorist at the time, Kenneth Arrow, argued, and this is weird, that if you're a racist, you would pay more in wages because you'd want to hire white workers and would have to pay a higher salary. Not thinking, of course, that racist employers are very happy to hire black workers or migrant workers or women and get them to do the shitty, cheap jobs at a low rate. They didn't understand at all about that. Also, this notion of a homogenous labour market. In the early 70s, I wrote about segmented labour market where ethnicity, gender, indigenous lines all intersect into, you know, sort of putting people into different segments of the labour where largely they're trapped and it's very difficult to break out on. And some of them even try and rationalise this. I refer to a paper by Peter Lloyd where he uses rational public choice theory to argue that if you think that the immigration of certain types of immigrants will challenge your wages, you're rational to oppose immigration and to oppose those immigrants. So really just justifying racism. Also, economic rationalisation doesn't understand small business entrepreneurs. I mentioned before this sort of homo economicus, the individual economic man makes choice solely on the individual, material maximizing choices in front of him. But of course, it's also her, but the her never got a big sort of run in there, classical theory. Basically, this is pretty laughable. We can see here the common theme in all the research we've done is how these entrepreneurs are embedded within the family and community. And even when a business is run by a male, and if they have a female partner, that female partner is often very strongly involved in the business in an informal way. And the family is often involved in the whole process. So really, they don't understand it. But the other point too is there that the minority entrepreneurs transform their lives and the built-in social environments of the neighbourhoods where the business is set up, Chinatowns and the like. And the most recent book that Branker and I and other colleagues have coming out from Palgrave looks at that particular thing. Basically, you know, this tells the same point that really there's a reification of entrepreneurship amongst the sort of the conservative neocons leads to entrepreneurship. Boosterism. You know, the reality is that there is family exploitation and co-ethnic exploitation. Just look at all the Fair Work Commission stuff on wage theft. And many Chinese, Indian, Korean, restaurants exploit Chinese, Indian, Korean, sort of international students and working holiday makers, etc. So there's really a contradiction. It's on the one hand, minority entrepreneurship, an example of migrant and minority and indigenous agency. And on the other hand, it's a very sort of contradictory an exploitative arrangement. So the final point I would like to make before handing it over to discussion is that the racialisation of Indigenous, refugee, Muslim and entrepreneurs plays out in a very complex, uneven, and contradictory ways, as does the discriminatory experiences of people with disability. The key thing here is mainly the institutional racism they face, the way in which it blocks their access to the labour market because of stereotypes about their lack of capacity and other negative stereotypes. Most of the people we talk to play down their personal experiences of racism. It's not a big deal in the stories they tell about their lives. The key thing is there's a multi-factor intersectionality here: gender, indigeneity, ethnicity, disability, refugee status, religion, and of course social class intersect in these sort of complex and contradictory ways. It's not always about race, but it's sometimes about race. Racism plays a key role in the motivations of some minorities, but at other times not. For some entrepreneurs, they're what the literature calls necessity entrepreneurs. They've got to create their own job. They're responding to block mobility. But for others, it's a passion. It's what they want to do. They have an individual or a family history of entrepreneurship. So at the back there, you can see there's a sort of a lot of references to what I talked to, and indeed links to some of the reports I've referred to. But I think I should leave it there